Have you ever wondered why some forces can fight and win against much larger opponents? From the Second Punic War to the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, today we're going to discover the history and the effectiveness of this method of asymmetrical warfare. We're going to uncover the strategies and tactics used by the likes of Rome, the Mongol Empire, and the American Revolution, and also explore how Ukraine has adapted to utilize technology and digital age tools to resist occupation. And finally today, we're going to find out why guerrilla warfare is going to remain a key part of future conflicts, no matter how powerful the enemy may be. In war, the battlefields rarely equal. Major military powers expand outward, subsuming their smaller neighbors into a grand design. Armies from the industrial age clash with armies that depend on swords and bows. Navies face off with privateers. Cartels point their rifles towards a drone miles above their heads. Regimes declare war on their own people, often whilst robbing them of any ability to fight back. It's difficult to find a war in history that wasn't defined by its imbalance of power, with one force that was bigger or stronger or more modern or better supplied than its enemy. In some conflicts, this imbalance is less a question of inches than it is orders of magnitude, with the underdog outmanned, outgunned, and cornered. Time and time again, guerrilla warfare has been the response to that. A pattern and principle of asymmetrical, often ruthless warfare, guerrilla tactics and strategy have allowed minor force after minor force to impose relentless punishment on a larger enemy that they're facing down against. A drawn-out, painful, and almost always defensive approach, guerrilla warfare provides means for the weak to overcome the strong, bleeding them dry and maybe, just maybe, forcing them to give it in. This is the first in a series we're working on called The Art of War. It's going to be diving into the tactics, strategies, and modalities that have defined warfare from ancient times to the present day. Now, if you enjoy this first entry in the series, please let us know in the comments. We've got lots of ideas churning above. We've actually already got one coming out soon because, well, I just liked it a lot. But if you guys do like it as well, let us know in the comments so we make more. The term guerrilla warfare originates from the first guerrilla wars, when humanity faced off against gorillas. No, I'm just joking. It's a stupid joke. The term actually originates from the Spanish word for war, guerra, with guerrilla basically translating to little war. The term was first coined during the French Duke of Wellington's expeditions into the Iberian Peninsula, during which he was fiercely resisted by Spanish and Portuguese irregular forces. However, the method of warfighting has a much, much older history. It stands to reason that guerrilla warfare was probably the first kind of warfare that humans practiced, waged with bone clubs and crude arrows in the millennia long before people organized themselves into enough numbers to need a standing army. Since then, guerrilla warfare has seen countless tactical evolutions, while the overall purpose has remained the same: survive and resist against all odds. From a strategic perspective, guerrilla warfare relies on campaigns of harassment toward enemies, intermittent and unpredictable engagement of their forces, and a heavy emphasis on leveraging any advantages, big or small, that the guerrilla force might have. This could include deep knowledge of the guerrilla force's home landscape, support from a local population, or any specialized weapons, tools of warfare, or civilian resources that can help to even the odds. By engaging in this pattern of warfare for as long as possible while actively avoiding pitched battle conflict and other direct confrontations, a guerrilla force's main objective is simply to buy time. The use and importance of that time, and how it's used in a strategic sense, depends on an individual conflict. Sometimes guerrilla warfare is used in order to slow down an invading enemy long enough for reinforcements to arrive, or even a larger army that can meet the enemy in orthodox battle. In other cases, the larger and more formidable force is just whittled down over time, taken apart by 50 smaller tanks, which, when viewed together, incur as many casualties and damages as a single large attack would. In still other examples, guerrilla warfare is meant to make the enemy force's conditions unbearable, such that the enemy force itself, their military commanders, or their political leaders are just forced to sue for peace. As such, guerrilla strategy remains a unique fusion of conventional military tactics with elements of political and socio-economic decision-making, as well as psychological warfare and other dimensions of battle that a larger and better equipped force just really isn't often prepared to contend with. While guerrilla warfare is ultimately a military exercise, combative force is just one of the many tools that's used to turn the tide of a conflict. The element of surprise is just as crucial as the firing of a gun, and creativity is often a more useful quality in a guerrilla commander than conventional tactical knowledge. And speaking of tactics, it's important to remember that the individual decisions of guerrilla fighters are heavily conditional on whatever resources they have at their disposal. But there are some time-tested guerrilla tactics that crop up again and again, and tend to guide the further innovations and choices of a particular group. Hit-and-run tactics are central to guerrilla warfare, a style of surprise attack in which a small mobile force attacks an unprepared or unfortified target that isn't ready to respond. Imagine a supply convoy or an infantry battalion making camp for the night, where guerrillas can attack quickly, overwhelming a small force of guards and do considerable damage before a larger defending force can arrive. By the time the defenders are ready to fight back, the guerrillas are already gone. They've melted away back into the landscape. Tactics like this are routine in a guerrilla fighter's playbook, with night attacks, use of the surrounding landscape and topology, and reliance on the local population for shelter and disguise. And these tactics can be leveraged for a variety of goals, whether to acquire weapons and supplies from their enemy during the early days of a conflict, or to directly target the soldiers of a conventional enemy force. So too are guerrilla fighters defined by their defensive and self-protective tactics, often traveling and living in small, decentralized groups with no base of operations to attack. The biggest advantage a guerrilla force has is that they are usually the ones to dictate when and where a battle takes place. The enemy army may be marching toward a city or a base, trying to make it to their destination and commence an offensive attack, but guerrilla fighters keep that enemy army constantly on the defensive, struggling to reach their target and protect their supply lines with no idea when or where they'll next be attacked. This tactical and strategic landscape turns the attacking army's war of conquest into a truly brutal ordeal, one where guerrilla forces give them every reason to just call it quits and go home. Now, before we go further, it's important to note one thing that's not homogenous within guerrilla warfare, and that's morality. People love an underdog story, and we here at Warographics are certainly no different. Also, those videos do well, but it's crucial to understand that the use of guerrilla tactics don't make either side of a conflict inherently good or inherently bad. As we'll discuss later, guerrilla warfare was just as crucial to the rise of Islamic State as it was to the American Revolution. And how we think about both of those social movements has very little to do with whether they were fought unconventionally. In most cases, it's true. Guerrilla fighters have far more to lose in a given conflict than their enemies, be it their homes, their way of life, or just about anything else. But ideology, political leadership, and heroic or despicable acts are what guides a war. Guerrilla warfare, by contrast, is a set of tools that anybody can use to get the war over with. One of the first known major conflict instances of guerrilla warfare took place during the Second Punic War, which was waged between Rome and Carthage from 218 to 201 BCE. During the war, Roman dictator Quintus Fabius Maximus was in charge of Rome's defense in the wake of a major Carthaginian victory early in the conflict. Aware that he lacked the manpower to beat back Hannibal's forces directly, Fabius instead made the conflict a war of attrition, hoping to exhaust Hannibal's forces long enough for a larger army to rise in Rome's defense. Fabius's Roman soldiers became raiders, harassing Carthage's supply lines and destroying the local sources of food that they knew Hannibal's army would need to survive. Since Fabius didn't actually oppose Hannibal directly, the war strategy was deeply unpopular in Rome, but it allowed Rome's vassal states to resist pressure from Carthage to turn against their hegemon and depleted Hannibal's army severely in the process. This would become known as Fabian strategy and formed the bedrock for later innovations in guerrilla warfare. Other ancient civilizations relied on guerrilla warfare as well: the Scythians, the Huns, the Vikings, and the Mongols, just to name a few. Each of those warrior cultures used asymmetrical tactics to win control over vast territories, and the Mongols in particular used their unique brand of horse archer swarm tactics to create the largest land empire in history. What's more, the Mongols did this despite being outmatched in manpower by most of the major enemies they defeated. Another somewhat later instance of guerrilla strategy's effectiveness was in Scotland in the early 1300s, with its modern reputation coming courtesy of a certain Mel Gibson. In the real events that inspired Gibson's movie Braveheart, a group of Scottish rebels used guerrilla tactics to resist occupation by English forces. Although the rebels were occasionally able to gather enough manpower from the Highlands to oppose the English in pitched battle, more often they defended their homes via surprise attacks, brilliant use of the Scottish landscape, and reliance on small war parties supported by the locals. This war would win back Scotland's independence in 1306. Over 4 centuries later, the guerrilla playbook would receive a major update in the form of the American Revolution, fought across the eastern seaboard of what is now the continental US. This war, fought between colonial insurgents and the soldiers of the British Empire, pitted the richest and most militarily formidable nation in the world at the time against an under-equipped and ragtag force, mostly made up of farmers and artisans. Military convention at the time dictated that troops fight en masse in neatly organized lines for what British culture at the time considered to be the gentleman's approach to combat. But the American colonists turned the tables, fighting from cover in the forests and the mountains of New England and the Mid-Atlantic region. In the process, they gutted British manpower and morale, and even as British commanders attempted to figure out this new kind of combat, they remained a step behind the rebels. These guerrilla tactics kept the movement alive until the colonies could field a proper military, and even once they did, the conflict never turned into the sort of gentleman's war that the British had hoped for. Instead, it was a valuable early experiment on the fusion of guerrilla tactics with a parallel independence movement. Moving into the turn of the 20th century, South Africa saw its own major guerrilla conflict, again with the British Empire on the receiving end. In the Boer Wars, an Afrikaner local resistance was able to compensate for their relatively small force and lack of substantial artillery. Instead of meeting the British outlanders head-on, the Boers engaged in a protracted, constant counter-offensive, relying heavily on individuals and teams of snipers who were able to withdraw before they were caught. The Boers were highly adept at surviving on the South African landscape, eliminating any need for centralization or resupply. This allowed many Boer units to stay mobile, basically indefinitely, and made it easier to besiege British positions, even with their smaller numbers. While the British struggled mightily with supply issues and tried to protect their backs, the Boers leveraged their local networks of control to bring districts and towns back under their control as soon as British occupiers left. However, Britain also adapted to this challenge with a common countermeasure, scorched earth tactics, in which local infrastructure, food production, and civilian populations were deliberately targeted so that the land would become inhospitable. They also used a second countermeasure, concentration camps, which, unfortunately, require no introduction. The Second World War also saw frequent use of guerrilla tactics on all sides of the conflict, depending on the conditions and the power balance within an individual battlefield or offensive. Perhaps the most distinctive example was that of the French resistance to Nazi occupation, in which dissidents organized into tiny cells gathered intelligence, smuggled British airmen, sabotaged infrastructure, and distributed anti-Nazi materials. This underground network eventually swelled in size to the point that it aided the Allied forces in taking back France, harassing Nazis who had thought they were outside the reach of Allied ground troops while restoring order in towns and villages. Another particularly fascinating example of guerrilla strategy during this time actually came from the Swiss, who never put their plans into motion but formed the groundwork for a years-long asymmetrical resistance to Nazi occupation. This plan, called the National Redoubt, was a result of the Swiss being aware that they couldn't defend their borders or lowland areas for long against Germany. Instead, they built a series of citadels into nearly impenetrable bunkers in the Alps. So the plan went that these citadels would host countless Swiss soldiers with nearly endless supplies, while fighter planes and irregular troops would continue to cause havoc for the Germans while the bulk of Swiss forces retreated. Again, this plan never had to be carried out, but it was a powerful testament to the value of guerrilla warfare as a carefully considered plan in the face of overwhelming odds. Now, lest you think we've only got Western examples for you, one of the most masterful uses of guerrilla warfare in the 20th century actually came from communist leader Mao Zedong in China. Obviously, we're not going to be endorsing Mao's treatment of his people once he took power, but regardless of anything else, the man was a savant when it came to asymmetrical strategy. Not only did he leverage his troops' ability to fight unconventional battles in order to draw out a war with Japanese and nationalist Chinese forces for decades, but he also enshrined his beliefs on guerrilla strategy in writing. Mao's view on the matter strongly emphasized surprise, misdirection, and being careful to choose the conditions for a favorable, even easy battle, or otherwise not engage with the enemy at all. These lessons were passed down directly to Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, as well as a range of other leaders within various insurgencies. And, well, speaking of Vietnam, the Cold War saw a range of proxy wars and major minor power conflicts in which smaller or less equipped local forces often received direct instruction in guerrilla tactics by either the United States or the Soviet Union. Aside from the efforts of the North Vietnamese against American troops, perhaps the most effective were the Afghan Mujahideen facing down Soviet invaders. Over a decade-long occupation, the Mujahideen used Western-supplied arms and tactics to wage jihad against the Soviets, making use of Afghanistan's unique abundance of caves along with hilly and difficult terrain. Although the Soviets were able to occupy major cities and towns, they were largely powerless to stop the Mujahideen from moving through the countryside, and even though the rebels were never able to coordinate on a large scale, they were able to turn their country into an absolute meat grinder for the Soviets. They would withdraw in 1989, close to the end of the Cold War. As we move into the 21st century, a quick look around the world makes it abundantly clear that guerrilla strategy is still very much a driving force within modern warfare. From the Ukrainian defense against the overwhelming forces of Russia, to the ability of low-tech groups like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda to resist the United States, to the many messy wars of the Middle East and Africa, asymmetrical and unconventional warfare are just as important as ever. To examine the ways that guerrilla warfare has evolved in recent years, we do need to focus on two examples: the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, and the Ukrainian defense against Russia. First, the Islamic State, which took over unprecedented amounts of territory as a largely guerrilla jihadist movement. It's a relatively uncommon but important example of a guerrilla movement that was both a resistance against an international coalition and an occupying force against the ideologically diverse and more often ideologically opposed people living in the territory that it took over. The Islamic State's foothold in Iraq and Syria grew out of the early 2010s, seizing upon the chaos of the Syrian civil war to grow their numbers and establish bases and revenue streams. Using small bands of fighters, usually equipped with small arms and quick, versatile vehicles like pickup trucks, they carved out territory within Syria's most war-torn regions as the regime and moderate resistance groups occupied each other's attention. The Islamic State used this time to consolidate their authority among Syria's jihadist groups, and in the summer of 2014, they swept through major Iraqi cities, energy and resource centers like oil fields and border crossings. Often, the cities and towns the Islamic State took would be held by hundreds or just dozens of fighters who were perfectly aware that the government couldn't respond fast enough to resist them. In rural desert conflicts, their fighters were often able to get the better of armed but slower adversaries, many of whom were unwilling to face Islamic State militants given their truly brutal reputation. However, this example also points to the major problem with using guerrilla warfare as an offensive weapon. Without local support, especially under a draconian and propaganda-heavy regime in which public beheadings, rape, and crucifixion were used as instruments of terror, the Islamic State fighters couldn't melt away into their cities when an international coalition response began. They could flee into the open desert or risk open conflict with local militias or the regime, fights that they still didn't have the numbers to win in the long term. After being driven out of nearly all of its territorial holdings, the group has recalibrated its objectives, still launching asymmetrical attempts and capturing some territory, but viewing that territory as one part of an insurgent strategy. Across the Middle East and Africa, Islamic State fighters still use guerrilla tactics, but they seem to have discarded their goal of establishing a caliphate anytime soon. And by the way, if you'd like to see a longer video on the Islamic State's rise, fall, and resurgence, just, again, let me know in the comments. Now, for our other example, we're going to switch gears in a major way and focus on Ukraine's defense of its territory against Russian aggression. This is another example of guerrilla warfare's value as a primary defensive tool rather than an offensive one, and Ukraine's fierce and creative war strategy fuses asymmetrical warfare with conventional measures. Now, we won't be focusing on the large-scale battles here, but instead on the subversion, the sabotage, the small unit actions, and the technological innovations the Ukrainians have used to level the playing field. Putin's forces have had to fight two distinct but closely intertwined wars in Ukraine. The frontline war to push forward towards Kiev, and the war that is waged constantly in their backlines and possibly even within Russia itself. Take the city of Kherson as an example, which was claimed by Moscow in the early days of the war, but liberated in November. For months prior to liberation, Russian troops in Kherson were under constant siege by sabotage, assassination, disinformation, and skirmishes in the surrounding area. Car bombs, poisoning, drive-by shootings, and more were constant reminders of the Russians' vulnerability, often made worse worse when the Ukrainian media would publicly identify Russians and collaborators who would be killed later on. Ukrainians behind enemy lines were also able to educate us and civilian population about how best to resist occupation and avoid forced migration to Russia. This pattern has played out again and again in occupied parts of Ukraine, with other notable examples including the bombing of the Kerch Strait Bridge. It's just one of many ways Ukraine has turned the tables on Russia, but the country has leveraged a massive network of military, paramilitary, and civilian operators to resist occupation at every level, often playing upon the incompetence and naivete of Russian conscripts opposing them. The head of Ukraine's military intelligence said as much in March of 2022 to quote, "The season of a total Ukrainian guerrilla safari will soon begin. Then there will be one relevant scenario left for the Russians: how to survive." And although the Russians' counterinsurgency tactics have been brutal, alleged to include the horrific torture of many civilians, the Ukrainians in their backlines continue to wreak havoc. Their targets aren't just limited to soldiers and officers either, but logistical support and supply lines too. In classic guerrilla style, these Ukrainian irregulars seem to operate largely autonomously, only communicating with other cells or with Kiev when it's explicitly necessary. Their goal isn't to amass any large numbers, but to keep their outfits small, versatile, and nearly invisible. And don't assume Ukrainian guerrillas are only active in Ukraine. They've also been able to launch numerous attacks on Russian soil, not only using drone attacks, but human operators as well. The explosions in the Russian city of Bryansk, a car bomb that killed the daughter of Russian ultranationalist Alexander Dugin, and unexplained attacks on an airbase just 150 miles from Moscow are among the instances where we can reasonably speculate there are guerrillas involved. And there's a very, very long list of mystery fires within Russia, mostly concentrated in the western regions, that Ukraine has neither confirmed nor denied involvement in. Their targets include power plants, fuel depots, military bases, enlistment officers, centers of heavy industry, and Russia's oil infrastructure, as well as political targets, and, well, we'll leave it to you to decode the subtext in all of this. The other curious dimension of Ukraine's guerrilla tactics is their creative integration of digital age tools into their war efforts. We've discussed Ukraine's innovative use of naval drones in a separate video, but this is just one of many examples of Ukraine's grassroots technological innovation during the war. Time and time again, the Ukrainian military and their civilian population have been able to produce low-cost, low-resource, but very dangerous tools that have helped turn the tide of the war, from turning consumer-grade drones into explosive swarms to potential fusions of AI with existing technology and weapon systems. While these aren't guerrilla warfare in the way Sun Tzu imagined it, they do represent a turn in guerrilla tactics. Ukraine and other outmatched defenders like them are heavily incentivized to search for cheap and effective ways to upset the balance of power, opening the door to new tactics that a bigger conventional power like Russia would have no reason to even consider. When we turn our attention toward the future, it's unlikely that we could lay out any hard and fast expectations about how guerrilla warfare will continue to evolve. We can expect to see it further integrate new technologies when possible. We can expect it to be used in more theaters of war around the world. But the very nature of guerrilla warfare is to subvert expectations in new and often hyper-specific ways, depending on the conflicts where it sees use. But what we do expect, indeed what we fully guarantee will happen, is that guerrilla warfare will continue to be a critically important part of modern and future conflicts. Even in the long arc of history, guerrilla strategy's most basic parts haven't really changed. You engage the enemy on your own terms, you remain mobile, you rely on the local population, you travel light, and you do it in small units that the enemy just can't prepare for. You figure out what your enemy expects, and you use those expectations against them at every turn. We said it at the beginning of today's video, and we'll say it here at the end. Every conflict is defined by some imbalance of power, be it in terms of manpower, resources, technology, or the will to fight. As long as these imbalances exist, and the more they skew toward one side, the more likely their enemies are to turn toward guerrilla tactics and strategy. They are the tool for the defending side, and a menace to soldiers and generals accustomed to conventional war and easy conquest. Above all, guerrilla warfare is the means for the weak to resist the strong, and as long as the weak choose to fight back, guerrilla strategy and tactics are going to survive right alongside them.